Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Katie Woodley, the natural pet doctor, and I'm excited to be joined by Billy Hoekman with Green Juju today. We are talking about a topic that has a lot of potential controversy, a lot of things around it. And I'm really, really excited that Billy is going to talk more about this. We're going to have a discussion and talk more about copper and the potential toxicity around it. If there's toxicity, what does it truly mean? Because there's a lot of things that I'm hearing from my community that I'm reading. And then, of course, I had to bring Billy in to get the facts and see what we know and what we don't know, because that's really, really important too. So welcome to everyone here who is joining us live. If you're watching this replay, there will be a replay on both Facebook and also YouTube at Dr. Katie Woodley, the Natural Pet Doctor. If you have questions about what we're discussing, maybe things that you've heard about, make sure to drop them in the comments so that way we can do our best. We're going to just have an open discussion about this topic. But first, because the man deserves an introduction, I'm going to do an introduction for Billy. So Billy Hoekman is the Vice President of Nutrition and Communication for Green Juju. He's involved in formulation, product development, working with farmers, science education, and sales and marketing. He participates frequently in expert panels and speaks nationally and internationally in venues ranging from universities and conferences to public libraries. He served on the board of directors for multiple organizations, attends AFCO meetings, and has numerous published articles. He's a trusted pet health advocate that specializes in turning hard to understand nutrition concepts into plain English. He lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania with his wife, Emily, their daughter, Nicole, and their dog, Huckleberry. I feel like at some point I should be able to say where you're from. So we're getting there, slow improvements. And
just say near Philadelphia.
You're in Philadelphia or near Philadelphia. Yeah. There we go. But thank you for everyone being here. Hi, Lisa, LaRonda, Lisa, Pam, it's great to see you guys. This is a really important topic and it can be really scary. But first I had to share, I'm wearing a t-shirt that Meowie Christmas. So it's the holiday season at the time that we're recording this. So happy holidays, everyone. So why not kick off the holidays with a controversial topic, right, Billy? That's what we're here for.
Exactly. And I apologize if my camera goes out of focus. It's been doing that lately. So it might be a blessing so that people don't have to look at me. But I am not wearing a festive shirt, but I always struggle with this. I do have something festive very behind me here. So that's exciting. Thank you so much for having me. I love interesting discussions about nutrition. And so that's one of the reasons we talked about doing this today. And especially when it comes to science and when it comes to discussion, I think it's good to get all different ideas and evidence-based ideas out there. So that's kind of, my wife makes fun of me for having no emotions. And so that's how I kind of approach everything, is just sort of, what is the data showing me, and how, what is my relevant experience with this? And so I think I can present some really interesting stuff today. And also I think one in nutrition like this, and for a while it was, vitamin D. And then there was a while when it was DCM, and there's a lot of just the buzzword itself, but not necessarily looking at, say, the actual, studies and information that we're actually dealing with here, to get an idea of what's going on. So I think that's exciting. But the first thing is I want to interview you. So I just want to ask you what, I know that when we were talking about doing this, you're like, oh yeah, I've been hearing about that. So, what have you been hearing about this just generally?
Yes. And I think too, for everyone here, if you've heard things, I've got my cat here who might high five me or smack me, just FYI for some entertainment. Drop in the comments what you've been hearing or reading about for the copper issue or potential issue too, because I think a lot of people are hearing different stuff. And some of it can be quite scary when you're not sure, is it true? I did want to preface before I answer that question too, with what Billy said is, one of the big things for me coming from like the conventional background as a veterinarian and my training and shifting into more integrative and holistic, one of the things that I've learned that's really helped me when we're hearing like different things and even learning different things is keeping an open mind. I have found that a lot of the things I knew like 5, 10 years ago are not the right thing anymore and not what I practice now because I continue to learn and grow and question. So I think that's really, really important too, is always to have an open mind and to know that we're learning and growing and that like the research is also growing too. So things that we knew last year could totally change next year because of research. So I think that's really, really important. And we may never know all the things. I don't think we ever will, right? The more you know, the less you know is
Oh,
something that
for
I think
sure.
reality, right? Especially I've learned so much from Billy in previous talks on nutrition and at live events where I'm like, sometimes we don't know everything about balancing, right? And the nutrients that are in the foods and the different meats and like all of that. And that's really important to keep in mind when we are approaching, especially potentially controversial subjects. So keeping an open mind is really important. But to answer your question, some of the things that I'm hearing about are like, I can't feed freeze dried liver anymore because it's going to create a copper toxicity issue is a big concern with a lot of pet parents in terms of the amount of copper that's in there. If a food is formulated with a lot of liver, is that going to create a copper toxicity issue too? And just for my personal experience, when I worked in the conventional clinic, we did a lot of liver biopsies when we saw elevated liver values like ALP and ALT. We did laparoscopic surgery. So we were able to take a liver biopsy pretty quickly, send it off to the lab to look for copper excess and a copper storage issue. And there were quite a few issues, but that's something that we're going to talk about too, because there's reasons behind that for some pets that might accumulate copper more likely than other animals. But I think there's a big concern around, is it a synthetic vitamin mineral issue versus a fresh food, whole food, or is it even both? And can you safely combine the two?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I want to go over sort of is the history of this issue, and I think it's really interesting. So this all really comes from this recommendation study paper here from not only Cornell University but several other university vets at other universities, and basically what they're seeing is a increase in liver issues and liver and toxic levels of copper in the liver over the last 20 years. Now, why is this specifically relevant to the last, say, 20 years? And could it go back further than that? Um, that is the question. And what does that relate to? So the first thing is, and by the way, I am going to be sending, for those of you guys watching this, I am going to be sending a links to all of these things that I'm actually looking at here for some of this information.
And we'll be
But
putting them in the description in YouTube after. So just you'll be able to reference all of these that Billy's referring to.
exactly right. So the first part of the first part of this information that I want to bring up is, so we have a lot of data on this, and it actually goes back to 1920, which for something in nutrition is a really long time. And uh, what we see there is sometime right around or after 1940 is when commercial pet food was invented, and that's when a majority of the animals around the country started to go on to kibble, essentially. And before that, I would actually argue that before that kibble was invented, pretty much all dogs ate diets that are more similar to the two raw diets or the diets that we make. Say your dog is on a gently cooked diet, say it's on a freeze dried diet, say it's on a frozen raw diet. I would argue that those were whole food, because how many people in 1920 to 1930 do you think were giving their dog a multivitamin every day with the synthetic form of copper in it? I would I would say zero. So it's really interesting because after the advent of kibble, you see a dramatic rise in the amount of copper in the liver of um, dogs, just generally. A huge dramatic rise. So the first piece of this is we're the correlation, there's a direct correlation there between the advent of commercial kibble and a lot more copper in a dog's liver. And I think that tells more of a story than, because the other thing too is, especially I mean, now people are making kibbles that have a lot of meat in them, and meat is the first ingredient. For many, many years, um, that was not the case. You have things like corn as the first ingredient, and even now, probably not your listeners and watchers and fans and whatnot. I don't know why I just said watchers. That sounds really weird. So, not your watchers, not your fans, but most people are still feeding, kibbles from the grocery store, where meat doesn't, where the things that are likely to have excesses of naturally existing copper are not a huge part of the ingredient panel. You're going to be getting more plants that are not going to be high in copper, but what they are high in is copper in a specific synthetic form. So first of all, we can
I want to touch on
see.
that real quick before you keep going. I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but I do see a lot of people who are on prescription diets. So this is a huge part of that synthetic vitamins and minerals, which you're talking about. So not just grocery store kibbles, but also think about if your pet's on a prescription food from your vet.
Exactly right. Think of the number of, so when we're taking this data of liver biopsies, think of the number of those animals that are on a all natural diet without any synthetic vitamins. If you look at the national average of dogs that are on that comparative to that are not on that, it's probably somewhere around zero, right? In the actual number that they're doing this for. So the first thing is that correlation shows that shows a correlation between synthetic copper versus and then there's another really interesting piece to this, which is, it's actually kind of funny because normally I don't use notes, but I feel like I really wanted to get everything right here, but because normally you don't see me like looking off or whatever, but it's the other interesting point that really points towards this being more of a synthetic copper issue versus a natural copper issue, i.e. naturally existing in food, is in 1997, AFCO made a big switch in the form of copper that they actually use. So they were actually looking at a study that showed that animals weren't getting enough copper. So they were using a feed grade version of a synthetic copper. So as an answer to this, AFCO's official recommendation actually switched to a much, much more bioavailable synthetic copper. And that is when, in the past 20 years, we've actually seen the cases of copper toxicity rise even more dramatically. So we went from, say, the synthetic version of copper that was making it rise anyway, and then we got into an even, I would, for lack of a better phrase, more synthetic, but much more bioavailable synthetic copper. And that's when, in the data that they're looking at, you saw these levels of copper toxicity rise. And that was back in 1997. So when we look at data and when we look at the science behind this, you could say, hey, we need to do more research into natural foods that contain copper. But none of this really pertains to that. Yeah. And this is where this all started. So I feel like we all want to do the best for our dogs and our cats. Sorry, you have cats on your shirt, so I feel like I have to mention it. But I feel like
we all cat people too. It applies to both. It applies to both.
we always want to do better, and so when we see something like, oh, hey, these people at Cornell University are tracking this rise in copper toxicity, so I need to stop feeding anything with copper in it. But that's not actually what the data showed. We're just sort of implying that into those diets. And on a personal note, I haven't, in dealing with foods that have more copper and not copper over the past, 12 years I've been in formulation and that kind of thing, I haven't really seen any negative effects from naturally existing copper, including working with animals that have copper storage disease specifically. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have a dog that is genetically has a genetic predisposition to storing copper, that you wouldn't do something special in that case, that you wouldn't limit it, or you wouldn't work with your vet in that case. But that also is not a good reason to take uh, copper and restrict it. It would sort of be like, here's a good example. Here's sort of an analogous way of looking at this. Some dogs, as they get older and have really bad kidney issues, need to limit the amount of protein they're getting, right? They need to have bioavailable protein, but they need to limit the total amount. That doesn't mean that you would ever just be like, let's just limit protein as a blanket statement across the board. So that's not a way of I don't think that's necessarily the way to look at it. And so I think people are sort of avoiding or wanting to avoid ingredients that might be high in copper. However, those ingredients are the healthiest ingredients you can actually feed your pet for many, many other reasons. And the other part about this too, which I think is really interesting, is not only does this point towards the synthetic vitamin packs, but synthetic vitamin packs are really just dangerous in my opinion, because a lot of times, especially with the larger companies and where this data is coming from, you just don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
Look at the Hills recall for all of the vitamin D. You have to use synthetic vitamin D and have to have a lot of it in comparison to other fat soluble vitamins to actually get a toxicity there. So that is so that's one part as well. But then the other part about copper that's interesting is it's just like every other nutrient in the body. And people are starting to do this more. If you tried to keep track of this, your brain would just melt. People will be like, if you take too much vitamin A, it depletes your vitamin D and your K2. And if you take too much vitamin D, then it depletes your vitamin A. Every nutrient is dependent on other nutrients in the body that you're eating and absorbing at any given time. And it's impossible, in my opinion, to figure that out. So a good example of that would be what affects the uptake of copper into the liver. Fiber for one, zinc for one, and other minerals. And so I think, going back to what we presented at the beginning of this, the data showing more to do with synthetic copper. I think if you're getting copper from actual sources in food, say, organ meat or fish or whatever you're getting your copper from, they are also going to have those other minerals in an actual natural proportion to moderate the uptake of that copper. So that's a big part of it as well. And that's kind of the whole point of really what I wanted to talk about was when you look at data, you have to go with what the data says and not sort of extrapolate out from there and so yeah. So again, I do want to reiterate, this is for the majority. What I'm speaking to is to the majority of dogs who don't have a predisposition to storing copper. But we don't even know that. We don't even know what the relationship between natural copper and dogs that have a genetic predisposition of storing copper. We don't even know if that's the same. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, I would argue you'd probably just want to be safe there and limit the copper, but we don't even know if that's true.
Yeah.
We just don't. And that's the thing about science. We don't know most things.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, because there can be a genetic predisposition, but like you're saying, we still don't know all the information. And even on I believe it was Cornell's website, they were detailing out usually a low copper diet, if you're choosing one from like the conventional side, so a processed food diet, is also going to be low protein. So if we that's the concern. If we start limiting protein for these animals because we want to limit copper because we're scared versus in reality actually understanding why and how this works, we're going to set that animal up for potentially a lifetime of health issues. The other thing too I was going to say is there's a whole host of probably other issues we just don't understand right now around copper. I know in the human functional medicine realm, like microbiome, other elements with like copper and iron, infections, like if we have dysbiosis, is that playing a part too? With these animals, we know a lot of animals are walking around with microbiomes that are off. These are really
Yep.
important for digesting and absorbing those nutrients and vitamins and minerals. So once again, when we start looking at, like you said, Billy, I use this term all the time, we end up missing the forest for the tree. And so we end up looking at one specific tiny minute area, which then we apply all these things and we make huge decisions and we can potentially create a lot more problems down the road when in reality, looking at how do we start doing more natural foods and integrating those in versus, once again, the processed food diets. Now, this isn't to shame or guilt anyone feeding those types of foods, but this is another reason why it can create problems for your pet down the road if we're using these synthetic vitamins and minerals.
And I feel like the reason that happens is because there's so many production steps in
Yeah.
those foods that they have to get the nutrition from somewhere. And
Yes.
the interesting thing was, and if you look at this, the actual study regarding this, in their first recommendation is to go back to the other form of copper. So you have to understand that this doesn't come from a world of where these people could consider like, oh, maybe, hey, maybe we should just use natural sources of copper. They don't understand that because they're in the AFCO world. They're in the I remember, I'll never forget, one of my mentors was talking to it was a guy who at AFCO meetings had been formulating pet food for like 40 years. This was in like, probably 10 years ago. And she said, why do you use corn? He said, because that's what you use in pet food.
Great answer.
That was it. And so these people, uh, they have an idea that these are the ingredients we need to use because we're over farming them and they would go into a landfill. So this is what we need to do. And so we have to add this synthetic vitamin pack. Um, and also, synthetic vitamin packs make formulating much easier as well. It's kind of like a cheat code for formulating. You can just do whatever you want and add this, synthetic vitamin pack. But what happens when you do so many processing steps on food and then the only actual vitamins are coming in the synthetic form? I'll tell you what happens, in my opinion. It's this. It's this exact thing. It's what we're dealing with copper. And the sad part is it hurts. For instance, us at Green Juju, when we make, we have a freeze dried food and we're also coming out with a frozen version of that food in March. And we use more liver than other brands. And it's because we want 99% of those vitamins and minerals to come from actual meat, because that's what dogs and cats, well, people too, they're just more efficient nutrients. They're the actual, like, made, it's not something your body has to convert. And that was the whole premise behind that. And there's not many foods you can actually use to get that premise. And we're really, really proud of that. And I would totally get it if someone isn't uncomfortable with that. But I do think that's where this can hurt, that is that there might be an animal that would benefit from being on that food that maybe they aren't, because uh, there's a perception that the copper could be, an issue or something like that.
So what would you say for someone who's maybe using still predominantly like a kibble diet that has synthetic, or even a freeze-dried diet, or, there are diets that are less or minimally processed that do have synthetic vitamins and minerals still added to them. There's still brands out there. Would it be safe from, I know we don't know all of the information, but would this be a
Yeah.
situation where you would not recommend adding in like a freeze-dried liver treat or anything like that?
Well, most of the foods that are like freeze-dried foods or minimally processed foods don't add copper to them. And I say that because it's actually interesting. So for anyone who's watching, if you email info@greenjuju.com. I actually made when we put out our food and there were some questions about the copper content, I actually made a chart that compares us to our national competitors in the freeze-dried realm. And we're basically the same as even all those companies that don't use as much organ meats as us. And so I think that says a lot as well, and just the copper content and just meat in general. And also, I think it says a lot about our sourcing because there's going to be a higher concentration of, say, certain minerals in cattle that's grain fed and gets a vitamin supplement versus grass fed cattle or grass fed bison or something like that. But the interesting thing about it is, yes, we're using more organs, but it's still the same. But yeah, I mean, I suppose if you were like, I don't think we know the correlation there, but if you were really worried about it and you were using, say, a processed food that has a copper vitamin pack in it, hard to say because we don't know what the data is, but I would just do whatever you're comfortable with because you could find good example. Somebody reached out to me and they were like, um, my dog has diabetes and they really like a treat at night. Which one of yours is the lowest in carbohydrates? They're all low in carbohydrates, but I suggested she do the rabbit trainer or the bison liver trainer or the salmon trainer because they have zero carbohydrates. So why not? Even though the other ones would work as well. So I think um, yeah. And I'm also seeing a question here. Some companies use no muscle meat at all and substitute heart meat. That is actually us. We are some
I was
companies.
gonna say that's you.
We we use muscle when we have to, but heart is so much healthier than muscle meat.
So
Side note.
the other thing too, so what would you say okay, let's say someone here, because a lot of people probably here are feeding a raw food diet or a lightly cooked, fresh food diet, minimally processed. So when I say minimally processed, we're not talking about processed, which is kibble. And they're using, there's no synthetic vitamins and minerals. There's still the concern over, you mentioned it with like the grain-fed animals versus grass-fed because of the vitamins that are put into I mean, there's all sorts of issues with the
Yeah.
grain-fed, intensive farming purposes. So should people still be scared about feeding a treat? Because there's so many different types of like freeze-dried organ meats, right? Or different
Yeah.
treats that incorporate that. And the majority, I would say, aren't going to be grass-fed. Now, there's a lot more companies that do. So if you can and you can afford it, 100% go that route. That makes more sense. But if for someone that's doing the things on the side, minimally processed food, from your opinion, and I know we don't have all the data on this, so it's really hard. It's not a black or white thing.
Mhm.
But from your experience, would you say like feeding that type of treat would be a no-go? Or would it be like, I think it's fine, even if it is a grain-fed animal? What would you
You
like?
can well, number one, this is my plug. I'll be like, just use the Green Juju bison liver. That's 100% grass fed.
Well, there's companies out there, and I understand that
Obviously,
not everyone
uh,
can access, but
a little tip for people out there, you know, and we're in the same boat. So we only do the full nutrient analysis on all of our products that are complete and balanced. But when you do a GA, so when you do your packaging, you need to put on fat, protein, fiber, moisture. When you do that GA test, they test for copper. So reach out to your companies and say, "Hey, I'm using this product. What's the copper content?" If you're concerned about that, and there's a couple other nutrients on there as well when you're just doing that test. So I think the better way to approach that would be to obviously the best version would be to find a company that is just feeding grass. But number two, just reaching out and seeing what the amount is. But I also want to really uh, sort of let people know that when it comes to testing in general, and I think we've talked about this before, but it changes every time. So when it comes to that bison
Mhm.
that we're using its liver, its nutrient profile depends on its genetics. It depends on the food it ate. It depends on a lot of different factors, and you're going to get a different level. And I know this is true because I've seen we have a bison food and we do nutrient tests on it, and I see different levels of nutrients, including copper, on every single one. So the idea that you can write a pet food company and say how much of nutrient X is in this food is going to change if they're doing it right. If they're doing it right and they're not using synthetic vitamins, you will get different amounts every single time. A lot of people can do like an average, but that's kind of so that's kind of what people should consider. So hopefully that answered your question.
You know what I feel like would come up, so I'm being the devil's advocate right now, is
Yeah.
the argument that you would receive potentially from a conventional veterinarian or nutritionist would be like, "Well, that's exactly why you should use a nutrient supplement pack, because then we know exactly what we're giving."
Yeah.
You know?
But the point is, like, if you're going by, and I'm like the funniest person to sort of talk about this in some ways because of the fact that, like, you've been to some of my talks. I'm like, look, it's the Wild West. Just feed nutrient dense foods, and that's all you can really do.
And
It's
then
how
it
I
turns
feed.
into a cluster for a
It's
lot
how
of
I feed
people.
myself. It's how I will tell you right now, because I always have to mention something about Maple, my daughter. Is this morning she had homemade raw eggnog for breakfast, and
God,
she
she's
calls it
amazing.
she calls it a milkshake, and it's the cutest thing in the world. But
The healthiest
very
child.
nutrient dense food. But did I just forget what oh yeah, I remember what the question is now. So um, that's true. But I would say to those people, what you're concerned about is that we hit nutrient minimums.
Yeah.
And you could still see variance knowing that you generally hit those minimums, if that's what you're going for, versus, um, hitting an exact amount.
Mm,
And I would say, like, if you want to hit exact numbers every time, you're doing that at the expense of everything else.
mm.
You're doing that at the expense of engaging in your body or your dog's body actually eating whole foods, which we know is better. I mean, you know it in your gut, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a great question from Barbara. What is the appropriate copper level in food?
So it's a very interesting question. So there is no maximum amount according to AFCO. I don't think that would be. Uh, I don't think
Why would
that's
there
right.
be when there's an issue, right?
I don't. I don't think that that's right because, and before that, it was actually at an insanely high number, and that was actually based on a study uh, with pigs. So not even dogs. It was just so, and that's the other thing people have to realize is a lot of these studies that come out, they just apply to dogs, right? Um, and so that was an insane amount. It was like 250 milligrams per kilogram. The minimum amount of copper that AFCO states, and this could probably be arguable as well, like everything else, is 7.3 milligrams per kilogram dry matter basis. So that is the minimum amount to sort of hit. Like when we formulate food, we're formulating to meet complete and balanced. So people can only feed that if that's their only option. Of course, we want them to feed other things as well. But so that's the best answer I can give you is um, depends on the dog. But I think when you're eating whole foods, sometimes it's gonna be a higher amount, sometimes it's gonna be a lower amount, but it'll all kind of equal out. Unless again you have a genetic predisposition and you want it to be somewhere lower than that.
Mm. I think this is also goes back to you've touched on it a little bit, and I know we've talked about it in the past. I've heard you talking about it at other events too. There's a question about green juju, and I think it's important to cover this because I trust your food. I recommend it for clients. But going back to you use a lot of liver, kidney, organ meats in the recipe, even though copper is extracted from the real food, shouldn't we be worried about the copper level being too high in the long term? So I can see where people are like, but yeah, if I'm feeding that over and over and over again every single day, doesn't that create a problem?
Not if you sort of go by what I sort of just laid out. I don't think it relates to what I'm trying to say with this entire thing is I don't think it relates to copper in general. I think it relates to specific forms of copper. So no, I don't think that. And also, again, I just want to reiterate that with Green Juju food, if you look at all different proteins from different brands, it's a scale. And here's a good way to look at that as well. Like a good example would be our pork is actually our lowest copper food. It's on the lower end of that scale. So great. If you are really concerned about it, you could do that. But actually, you notice trends. When I was doing that comparison data, you notice trends. And what you notice is things like emu, things like bison are all higher. I think that like more natural species or like game species are tend to be higher in most nutrients, including copper. Um, um, but then also on the flip side of that as well, our lamb and goat is kind of right in the middle as well. In our rabbit with duck liver, which we use a lot of liver in our rabbit with duck liver, is towards the lower end of that spectrum as well. So no, I don't think that uh, if you consider our food to have high copper, I don't think that that long term would lead to issues based on copper, at least from the data that we know. Um,
Yes, and I think that
Generally.
goes back to the beginning where you showed the data, and a lot of the concerns come from the synthetic vitamins and minerals because they're not naturally processed in a way that's essentially what we're made to do in nature. The body's pretty powerful in terms of being able to utilize nutrients. Now, this is where I always say, if you're eating a salad every day for every single meal, you're probably going to end up with nutritional deficiencies. But those aren't high, rich, nutrient filled foods either, right? Like if you're eating iceberg lettuce every day, you're going to have a problem. So
Yeah.
when we look at what are nature's vitamins and minerals, what have dogs in the past, as you mentioned, before 1920 or before 1940, they weren't being fed multivitamins. We don't, we're extrapolating, of course, back to that time. But I think it comes down to, looking at the data, assessing it, and then also to thinking about, you know, real food. It's, synthetic vitamins and minerals. This is like eating Cheerios every day. Synthetic vitamins and minerals, like you're not going to do well. Your kid's not going to do well if that's all they eat, even though it's technically balanced, right? Fortified with the vitamins and minerals to help them. That's the marketing. So unfortunately, it's the same in our like the pet food industry with a lot of the marketing. And so we do have to look at, like you said, the data that we'll post in the description too. So you can take a look at the research articles and see that it's not based on liver. It's based on a synthetic copper mineral.
Yeah, from what we know. And that's the key is that me and Dr. Woodley here are not trying to say we know everything. What
No.
we're trying to say is
The
what
more
we're
you
trying to
know,
say
the
is
less you know.
yeah, follow the data, and that's really where the discussion begins. Is like and I immediately uh when I first heard about this, I immediately thought to myself, wait a minute. The first thought I had was of all these dogs that are being biopsied, how many do you think, like I said before, are on raw diets that have no synthetic vitamins?
The ones
Zero.
that I biopsied weren't. That's,
Exactly.
like they
So
were on Kibble.
so that's just the interesting part, and that's what's so cool about nutrition is we can continually learn, and that's what I love so much about it is that we can continually, change and learn. And I'm in the same boat as you. Things I thought were true five years ago, I had no idea how much. Here's a good example of something have learned so much more about since joining Green Juju. Just the what plants can do for for dogs. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm even thinking like I could have done better with when Lua passed away. I could have fed her more plants. I could have done this and that. And we all could do better at all times. But I mean, I've learned so much about that and learned so much about, the benefit there that I'm sure in 5 years there'll be something else. So this is just part of that, I feel like.
Yep, definitely. I always say, I mean, there's so many things I wish I'd done with Finn. But because of him, I learned more and then I continue to learn more. And I think that's really, really important that we don't get stuck in it's our way or the highway, is really, really important, that open mindset for learning. And the other thing too, you might be thinking, I'm seeing some questions. I wanted to address them because you might be like, well, how do we know? How do we know my pet is potentially having an issue with copper? We don't want to get to a phase where you have like liver failure, lots of inflammation, scarring, things like that, which can happen. This is where doing routine blood work, your liver values ALP, especially ALT, are specific to the liver inflammation. A lot of times those will rise. And this is one of the key things where I talk to my clients, like make sure you get your blood test results so you can measure and monitor it. If you're noticing, especially ALT is slightly increasing and it's still within the normal reference range, I always say, why? That's a huge question I always ask for everything. Why is that happening? What is changing? And then ideally, you would do like a liver biopsy if we're concerned with the high liver values. Now, that can be very expensive. It is invasive. That is gold standard. That's what we ideally would do. The other thing that we can do that I do a lot of, which is a great question that's coming up, are hair tissue mineral analysis tests. And there's quite a few companies that do them. We do them, but that will also show us if we have potentially a copper issue. But also, too, it looks at like heavy metals. It'll look at other vitamin, mineral balances within the tissue. So it's very different than a blood test. You want to use someone that knows how to interpret those test results, but that can give us an idea too in relationship to like the iron, the manganese, the zinc levels, all of those other things. Remember, everything is interconnected. As Billy mentioned at the beginning, we don't want to just start supplementing things like zinc or other things because we can create other mineral imbalances too. But some of those tests are really helpful and aren't invasive. They're non-invasive. They don't cost a ton of money, but they can give you an idea of what's happening internally with your pet. So you don't have to sit and worry or limit their diet when you really don't need to if you're using a lot of these fresh foods.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, that's a great way. Somebody said in the comments was like, blood tests are a good thing, hair tests to determine, regardless of diet, determine what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and always monitor for outward signs. And this is where someone like you, who can take a look at some of those things, it really comes in handy. Um, and again, it just goes back to your specific dog. I mean, I'm seeing a comment here about breeds not being prone to copper storage. I think what they're finding now is that more breeds are, um, it's not just breeds that we traditionally thought were prone to copper storage. The ones that actually have the genetic predisposition is probably a little bit more widespread than we think it is.
Hmm.
Um,
That's
but
really
again, I would,
common though. That's so common.
yeah,
It's just like the MDR1 mutations. Before it was like, oh, it's collie breeds and herding breeds. And now all of a sudden we're like, oh, look, now we've learned more. And it's all these animals that even mixed breeds. So, it definitely genetic predispositions. But then again, once we start learning more, it's just like you're saying, probably a lot of these animals are having issues. But also too, I would wonder, is there an issue with like detox pathways and inflammation building up also? There's a lot of stuff on the human side with copper and inflammation. Now, synthetic copper and things, there's a lot to this story too. We just have zero idea over. But once again, just looking and asking these questions, I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing
yeah, for
out
sure.
loud, like looking at what are these interconnections from a true holistic with a W approach, because detoxification, inflammation, all these things, we have lots of toxins and chemicals also. Are they potentially interacting and with these synthetic vitamins, minerals, not allowing the body to process it well? There's so many factors. And once again, it's not to overwhelm people listening. It's to help you feel empowered, like, hey, I need to focus on these foundations. What can I do to remove the resistance to the body to do what it needs to do to be healthy is the key thing. And it comes down to food, it comes down to detox, it comes down to stress, it comes down to microbiome, gut health, the digestion. All of those things are really important factors for everything to function well.
That's exactly right. And I think supporting the liver becomes just a good idea in general, say supporting it with bone
Yes.
broth. Um, there are a lot of ways to support the liver, and one of those ways too is just to establish a lot of moisture in the diet as well, and supporting all those things like the liver and the kidney. Um, but and even raw milk and things like that. And so the thing that I really want people to take away from this is um, if you if you have a statement, you have to have an argument behind it, or else it's just a statement. So if someone were to say, like, I understand you could say you can feed too much liver. Okay, if somebody did a 100% liver diet, they would be doing too much liver. Um, but to say you can feed copper, too much copper from organ meat, even if it's not synthetically derived, you actually have to have some data to show that point. It can't just come from more dogs have liver toxicity issues with copper, therefore this food has copper in it, therefore can lead to that. You actually have to show that connection with data. You can't just say, well, it makes sense to me, so that's that way. So that's kind of just a lesson in critical thinking, I guess. But um, that's kind of where I wanted to take this was what do we know? And what we know is a little bit about the synthetic form of copper and where the data is actually showing it. And for me, the strongest point is that advent of commercial dog food point where we can see those numbers go up because commercial dog foods all have one thing in common for 99% of them, and that is synthetic copper and low in actual copper containing ingredients. So, um, yeah, I think a lot of good points so far.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder. There's not a lot of fresh foods that are rich in nutrients in those kibble diets. And so, I did an exercise the other day. I talked with Jay and Adrian, two crazy cat ladies, about it when we were discussing it the other day, where taking snapshots of different like prescription diets and different foods from a big brand. I won't name them. We can make guesses. I'm sure we can all guess who they were. And I just wanted to look at their ingredients, not with the name of the brand on it and the type of prescription food. They were all the same ingredients, just rotated around a little bit with all
Yeah.
synthetic vitamins and minerals. I literally could not tell a difference. And so I think looking at that, it goes back to what you said, like you can really just take that synthetic vitamin and mineral pack and you can balance any type of diet and have really poor quality nutrients. And that's right now what we're seeing with the data that you have to show that it's more likely a synthetic issue. Once again, being smart about what you're feeding, not just feeding like a liver diet. Your formulations for Green Juju, for people who are still a little weary about it, you're not just using liver. It's not just you, it's not a liver diet by itself. You're
Yeah.
still balancing it with other ingredients for the other nutrients and to create balance for those pets that feed that or for that are eating that food.
And just a reminder, we will have the frozen. I have to plug, all this helps pay for my daughter's Montessori school. So,
And
um,
her smoothie, her eggnog smoothie.
and her eggnog. We will have the frozen version coming out in March, which will be the same exact formula. So for those of you that love our very, very limited ingredient efficient formula, it'll become much more affordable for big dogs and medium-sized dogs. So
I do have to put a plug too. What's nice that most people don't know unless you've heard him talk before is that you can feed it to cats. It's formulated for cats. So this is where I work with a lot of pets that have gut health and skin issues, and it's really nice to have the balanced diets that are limited ingredient, that are fresh food, minimally processed. It makes it really easy for dogs and cats to help heal them and reduce that burden while we're readjusting their gut and the immune system and all those things. And I'm not worried about the copper with your food. A lot of my clients use it and I've never seen an issue. And I have clients right now that on hair tissue tests, some of the copper increased. I'm not worried about them using Green Juju because there's other things that need to be adjusted also. And it wasn't due to the food that you were feeding. I'm not seeing that correlation when we are using those fresh food diets. So in my experience, take it for what it's worth, but I'm not seeing that connection with the raw foods and the fresh food diets. And
And
yeah,
Dr. Woodley is never wrong about anything.
don't listen to
That's
Billy
what I'm
on that.
saying. That is
I'm
what I'm
just saying,
saying.
in my experience, like it's my experience, and I'm one to be fully transparent. Can ask my community if I say the wrong thing, or that's why learning is really important. That's why I love having Billy come on, because he makes me question the things that I thought I knew. And I'm like, oh, we need to shift the way we think about this. And, I think it was really fascinating when you said when you started testing, you're seeing different vitamins and minerals and nutrients in those meats when you're using grass-fed, pasture-raised animals. And it just comes down to that's probably what our body needs. When we're getting variety, that's how we stay in balance. That's how we don't become nutrient deficient over the long term, because we're eating a different variety of foods and meats and vegetables and all those things. And same with our dogs and same with our cats. It's really, really important.
And that's why we formulated the food to be kind of like a feeding system, because the food is so limited ingredient. We wanted people to find a base that they could go on and then use our other products to get that rotation in there. So, rotate between our veggie blends, use, our goat's milk, which is, the most nutrient diverse food, and do a lot of these different things, because that's as close as you're going to get to a complete diet. I mean, I know that for me, when I feed Huckleberry, I feed our food, I feed egg yolks, I feed sardines, and that's really the base of his diet. And then I do the blends and stuff on top of that. But for me, it comes down to how do I get as many nutrient dense foods into this dog's diet as possible that are I would consider to be complete or very near complete. So,
Yeah.
and I will say too, we got a lot of we got food coming. We got a lot of interesting stuff we're working on, and some stuff I think that'll be really different. So, if you're a Green Juju fan, there's a lot coming out in the future.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we need more companies like yours that are transparent. And it's also really nice to be able to hear from the person that's formulating it also. That's not always common practice with a lot of pet food companies. So it's really nice to hear the insight into how they actually formulate the diet and the concerns too, like this copper concern, and how you address it and how you look at it. And I think it's important for every pet parent here to take that into consideration, because I'm seeing some comments like every pet is an individual. There are a lot of
Yeah.
pets who are sensitive to things. Those are like check engine lights that we have to look into. Why is that pet sensitive, and help them heal? And this is also too, it's not just feed the same food, even if it is a fresh food diet, day in and day out. That is not going to help optimize your dog or your cat's health. You mentioned how you feed Huckleberry. My cats, I have a lot of different brands and rotation and different proteins from the companies that I know, like, and trust, that are doing the testing, that are transparent with the ingredients that they use. And it's one of those things. I would love to home cook for my cats. I just don't. So, but that's just not my thing. So I use the companies I know,
How
like,
dare
and
you?
trust. I know, right? Like lazy. I am so lazy.
Exactly.
I should be
Well,
doing it
and
right now while we're doing this live, prepping for my cat's meals.
I say
So
all the time too that the way that I feed Huckleberry is it's like a stool, and there's three legs, and then one of them is the food I make, which is like my favorite part of the day. It just
you love that stuff. That's,
I just love that. But then the second one is we make most of our food at home, and he gets plenty of stuff falls on the floor, and he gets that. And then the
yeah,
third part is Maple loves giving him food that she's eating, which luckily is all mostly healthy, but that's part of it. That's part of his nutrition. If
yeah,
she's eating a sardines and she just gives him a sardine, that's part of it. Or if she's eating whatever she's eating, broccoli or whatever. And so even if you're just, let's say, you're feeding Green Juju food, or you're feeding some other things, just even adding some of your own food is fine.
yes. It's the eating experience. It's so important. Last night, for example, I know, well, I think I'm in a safe space for this. One of my cats will sit on the table next to me. My husband doesn't approve, but I don't care. It's fine. And we literally, like, we had some like pork roast or something. And I was just giving him some. He loved it. He was so happy. And it was like one of those things where I know where it's coming from. Like I'm eating it myself and make sure it doesn't have any like sauces or things on there that could potentially like cause GI upset or harm. But he loves it. He's actually trained to a pig noise. Thank you, my husband, for that, where you snort and he knows he gets like some fresh human food. And I want to I said it myself just then, human food. Human food is real food and it is pet food. Like,
Yeah,
so it's okay to feed your animals the foods you're eating because it's part of the experience and it's helpful and important for them too. Now I'm not saying you have to do that, but it is a thing. And I find so many people have fear around food, and then this is important to learn about and just watch and look into the data. But I don't want it to create more fear around a really good source of vitamins and minerals when we use liver as a fresh whole food source. So I think that's something to be aware of too. There's a lot of fear around food, especially with our pets, because we've been made to believe that processed food is pet food, when in reality, pet food should be human food.
exactly. And I do want to make you jealous really quick. We just got our pig that we get every year,
Oh.
and actually it was kind of a fun day because Judy Morgan also came up with her husband Hugh, and she got a pig as
Oh,
well. But we get a pig for our family every year to eat, and it's really really nice way to be connected to your food and
yeah.
connected to the local farmers. But it's really pasture raised pork. They have a giant pasture that they're in, and they're actually also fed raw whey from raw cheese making. So this is raw whey fed pasture raised pork. It's organic. It's the best pork you can buy in the world. And because of the fact that our cheese maker raises our pig, and then our butter guy actually processes our pig.
Oh.
So because of that, it's $3.30 a pound.
Okay, I am jealous. Here's the thing though, when we lived in New Zealand, this was something like I think it is really important to understand where your food's coming from, and if you can support local farmers, 100% do that. Really, really important that we support them and keep them in business. And when we lived in New Zealand, we had our own sheep, we raised lambs, we did eat them. And it was one of those things where I wasn't part of the end process. I was like, "Take them away to the butcher. I don't wanna be there because I do get attached." But I knew the amazing life that they lived, and they were the best tasting lamb. I'm not gonna lie, maybe because they weren't pets. I wasn't allowed to name them, but it was one of those things, like, I knew what went into them, the life that they had, the stressors that they had, and I could appreciate that and give grace for that too. So I think it is one of those things that's really, really important. I love my dear mother. She would never eat our lamb when she visited us, but yet if we bought it from the grocery store, she would eat it. So it was really, like, ironic.
That's
But
funny.
but
Um,
yeah, I it's one of those things like, I think it's great. I love that everyone is here asking questions and commenting. We do have a free resource for a simple guide to improving your pet's like nutrition with some brands for cats and for dogs that you can check out at our website. I'll put the link in the description so it's easy to find. But once again, I think we're both reiterating, do your research, keep an open mind, make sure we're not making assumptions from just hearing scary things, and looking at the true data and where that's coming from are key things for any area, but especially for like the copper potential issue that we're seeing right now. Would you agree,
yeah,
Billy? Or you have anything to
yeah.
add to that?
To put a bow on it, basically, I think that the data that we're seeing is connected over time because you can look at two different timelines to synthetic copper, and I think that's
Yep.
from what we know, that's more the problem than naturally occurring copper. And so I would say feed as natural diet as you possibly can. You want all of your vitamins and all your minerals and all of the other various nutrients that come out of food to come from food, and you'll be much better off. And keep that in mind. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and for everyone that doesn't know who Billy is, you should. You can find more information and all the amazing foods that they offer and whole food I don't want to say supplements because they're not, but all the products that Billy has at Green Juju with him and Kelly. Definitely check out Green Juju if you haven't. And then if you need more information, guidance, help with your pet's care, figuring out any health issues with skin, gut problems, definitely reach out to us at the Natural Pet Doctor. You can send us an email or send us a message. More than happy to share some of the resources that we have with you too to help you get started or continue on your path. Keep learning, keep growing, keep an open mind. And I know we'll have Billy back for another topic. We just have to decide which one we're going to do next. So
Sounds good.
thanks so much for your time, Billy. And thank you again, everyone, for taking time out of your busy day to learn a little bit more and to help your pets thrive naturally. Take care.
Everybody have a happy holiday.